as well.
Because Lee had been something of a dam builder.
Oh yes,
Some particular cases.
that's right. That's right. And that was a populist, sort of liberal cause, to build these dams, put people to work, bring electricity to rural America, the
compete
REA.
with the private utilities.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so he was very much on the dam building thing. I think he supported the Ritchie Dam on the Big Hole, things like that. But he drew back when it came to the Missouri breaks. He understood that there were higher values there.
And I think he evolved over time.
He did.
Became less aggressive on his stance.
He absolutely
on
did. Building
dams, either in state or out of state.
Well, the depth of his conservation commitment and philosophy deepened as the years went by. When he reached the end of his tenure, at that point he was looking back and wishing that he had been able to accomplish even more. And of course, what he did was phenomenal. But he was regretting that there were some shortcomings that he wished he could have made up for. But of course, had run out of time.
So we're here in the Shoto, so of course I've got to ask about A.B. Guthrie.
Well, I knew Bud very well. In fact, for many years I taught a wilderness field course, university level, through two different universities along the Rocky Mountain front. Would go back in the front for anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks on trips and meet with a lot of different people. We always stopped by what he called the barn, and met with Bud, and it was just always kind of the highlight. And Bud at that time was he had emphysema and he was on oxygen. He had to measure out his energy, and his late wife Carol was very protective of Bud's energy level and so on. So she'd always greet us and say, well, Bud's just kind of getting up from his nap, give him a little bit of time and try not to take too long, and then we'd get in there and Bud would become animated and just full of energy and would spend 2 hours, But great guy. We sometimes would have gatherings up at the Seven Lazy P back in the, 70s and 80s, and Bud and Carol would show up and visit with everyone. He was certainly an inspiration. Very talk about a passionate, a person passionate for the Rocky Mountain front. I was certainly Bud Guthrie.
And courageous. I remember one time reading his speech that he gave to the Great Falls Chamber of Commerce. And he gave him some hell. And spoke very clearly and very distinctly about his passion for wilderness and conservation to that group.
Yeah, well, they needed to hear that message. I don't know how receptive they were, but they needed to hear it.
Right.
Just like Charlie Russell did, you might recall.
What was your wilderness field course?
It was a couple of different things. I taught a course, an extension program through the University of Montana, and that was, what did we call that? That was just a week-long backpack, largely for continuing ed for school teachers coming back to get credit. And that way would backpack across the Scapegoat in late June. The other course was called Wildlands. It's called Wildland Studies program. It was sponsored by San Francisco State University, and it was a 6-week program. And sometimes I would do a spring program for 6 weeks in island biogeography and the Missouri River. So we'd spend 2 or 3 weeks floating the Missouri River from Fort Benton down to Kip, and then would go island hopping in all the different in the Little Rockies and the Castle Mountains and the Highwoods and all these different island mountain ranges, and camping out and hiking and meeting with different people, like for example in the Little Rockies meeting with Native Americans about the Pegasus Gold debacle, and then climbing up on Mission Peak and looking down at the atrocity and
which is still
doing,
a problem.
And actually we did a photojournalism element in all of those programs where the students would come back to Missoula. At that time I was based out of Missoula, would come back to Missoula, go to MCAT, and produce a television documentary on what we had done and seen. And so would do a lot of video, just like we're doing here, and lots of interviews of people. And then they would put a production together, maybe a half-hour production that would then be televised on MCAT. So we did that quite a few years. Then let's see, the other program in the front was typically in the Badger 2 medicine, and would meet with a variety of people. Lou Bruno would always meet with us and accompany us up into the forks of the Badger. Would meet with Native American folks too, and talk about, and at that time, of course, oil and gas was the big issue. And so, yeah, it was very experiential, field-oriented. So we were hands-on, on the ground, learning about wilderness in the wilderness. And so we'd go into a lot of wilderness history, policy, legislation, things like that, but also just wilderness skills, and doing maybe a 2-week backpack from Summit down through to Blackleaf, all the way through the Badger 2 medicine. Wow. Phenomenal program. These were students typically from universities all over the country that were taking it as a full 6-week semester, or half semester, I guess it was, that take time out during the summer to pick up credits, but to do it through an extension program.
And I bet you we have some members right now from MWA that participate in some of those.
Yeah,
programs.
very likely, because I certainly pushed MWA in those days,
right, urging
people to join.
Another strong personality is Doris Milner.
Oh gosh, the fondest memories of Doris. I have to admit, as a young graduate student in my early 20s, way back in 1966, when I met Doris Milner, I could hardly, I didn't know there were people like that. I was just in awe. And she was, at that time, relatively new to conservation work. She really hadn't gotten involved with MWA yet. She had, with the constant behind-the-scenes prompting of Guy Brandborg, she had formed the Save the Upper Selway Committee in 1964, and had almost single-handedly been able to stop the Forest Service in its tracks from proceeding further on its development plans in the Magruder Corridor. In 1963, the Magruder Corridor had been taken out of the Selway-Bitterroot wilderness. I don't know if you want to hear a little bit of that history, but it was a phenomenal move by the in the Kennedy administration by Secretary Orville Freeman, who signed an order declassifying 373,000 acres in the Upper Selway River, known as the Magruder Corridor, that was part of the Selway-Bitterroot Wilderness, and in reclassifying under the new U1 regulation to actually make it, this is before the 64 Wilderness Act, this is 1964. And so with the stroke of a pen, 373,000 acres of wild country became open for development. That added impetus to the 64 Wilderness Bill, because that's what we've been saying all along, is that you can't trust the bureaucrats to protect wild country. We need the permanency of legislation. We need a Wilderness Act. But certainly Freeman made the case, made our point,
right,
but with a stroke of a pen. So that ensued, and so therein ensued the Magruder Corridor controversy. Doris was the key citizen protagonist on that. I mean, she was the key citizen leader for conservation and to reinstate the Magruder Corridor as wilderness. It took 17 years, but upon passage of the 1980 Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, Doris's dream was fulfilled. And it's in large part due to her tenacity that this was accomplished. And during this period, during the 70s, Doris served several terms as president of MWA. So she really matured as a nationally respected conservation leader beginning in '64 with the Selway Bitterroot battle, or the Magruder Corridor battle, and then going all the way through the Frank Church River of No Return and beyond.
That narrative has a lot of parallels, I would say, with Cecil Garland, the Forest Service, and the Scapegoat Wilderness.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And Cecil is to the Scapegoat what Doris was to the Magruder Corridor. Absolutely. And Cecil was unquestionably the key conservation activist and leader behind the designation of the Scapegoat as our nation's first citizen-initiated wilderness back in 1972. So yeah, what a phenomenal accomplishment that was, and what a huge obstacle he had to overcome, because up to that point, all wilderness that had ever been designated was the result of agency work, of the agency saying, here's the boundary, and in fact, in 1964, when the Wilderness Act passed, there were 54 areas totaling a little over 9 million acres that became instant wilderness upon passage of the act, including 5 areas in Montana, the Bob Marshall, Gates of the Mountains, and Cabinets, and so on. Well, those were all drawn by the Forest Service. Those boundaries were not the result of citizen activism, of citizens saying, oh, wait a minute, you've left this out, you've left that out, your boundary is inadequate, this is what needs to be done. And then going to Congress to get that done, going around the Forest Service or over them or under them or over the top of them, whatever it takes. And so the accomplishment of the Scapegoat Wilderness that was spearheaded by Cecil Garland is enormous. I mean, it's enormous just in its own right, adding 240,000 acres within the complex, protecting that southern buttress of the Bob Marshall country. That in itself is enormous, but it's also enormous nationally as an incredible precedent that says, hey, citizens petitioning to Congress are going to start doing this more and more. In other words, wilderness sort of matured from being just sort of an in-house administrative good old boy, let's go ahead with this wilderness on the rock thing, that should satisfy them. It matured into probably the greatest expression of our democracy that we have in our country.
And it's really ironic that is during the negotiation and compromise to get the Wilderness Act passed in 1964, dealing with Wayne Aspinall, turned out that it really opened up the way the bill was finally written for citizen initiative, or otherwise it would have all probably been
exactly.
Then forevermore top down.
Exactly right. The way it worked, and some of the demands made by Aspinall have indeed backfired probably on his original intention, and that was to constrain the expansion of wilderness. But in fact, we've gone from those original 9 million acres to more than 111 million acres now within the wilderness system, and with 700 and some areas designated as wilderness across the country. And of course, 2/3 of that is in Alaska, but still there's a significant legacy in the lower 48. And Montana probably has the most significant unfinished legacy with respect to wilderness of any state remaining. You know, we just have not passed a statewide wilderness bill, for example, unlike most every other place. And we came very, very close in 1988, as you all know.
Yes.
And we can get into that if you want. But
Lou Bruno and Pat Williams just recently told me quite a bit about that story. You get into some specific people too.
Oh yeah.
When you talk about that, Conrad Burns.
Well,
Dick Cheney.
I'm sorry?
Even Dick Cheney is an operative in that.
Yep. No, he didn't help us any.
No. One more personality as a scientist and forester is Gloria Flora.
Oh boy. Well, she's become actually, maybe I'm not overstating it to say that she truly is a national folk hero. From her incredibly courageous decision to say no to oil and gas leasing on the Rocky Mountain front. Now that was an administrative decision, but it was a courageous one, and she was backed up. It was tense, I know, internally, but she was backed up all the way up to the chief's office because she had gone through the process and she had listened to people. And I remember how impressed I was when I first met Gloria at a hearing that she held in Missoula. And she held hearings in Great Falls, Missoula, Helena, several communities, about what to do about oil and gas leasing on the Rocky Mountain front. But I remember how impressed both my wife Polly and I were. We attended that in Missoula, and how impressed we were that she was totally focused and listening to every person. This was not your typical bureaucrat that had already made up his or her mind and was just going through a pro forma process. This was a person who was really listening, and we were very, very favorably impressed. I'd never witnessed that before in working with agencies, public land management agencies for 40 years. I'd never actually seen that level of responsiveness before. And of course the decision that came was incredible. And it really made it possible to continue the momentum toward legislative withdrawal that was sponsored originally by Senator Burns, and then when Burns was defeated by Senator Tester in 2006, Max, to his credit, got the job done during the lame duck session of that year, and got it attached, as I wish we could do with our heritage bill. But anyway,
I need a little reminder. Who was Gloria Flora?
Gloria Flora was supervisor of the Lewis and Clark National Forests when the oil and gas issue here was really raging. I mean, we're talking in the early 2000s. You know the years? I don't remember the exact years, but up to about 2005, maybe.
Yeah.
And so then she came up with a decision that said no to oil and gas leasing, additional oil and gas.
I remember
leasing.
the history. I couldn't remember exactly what her office was. Yeah.
Well,
We take a